Greetings! We are beginning our next lesson in the Psalms, and I invite you to open your Bible to Psalm 73. If you have a Bible handy. Psalm 73 is the psalm that we're going to spend our time in, and it really is a beautiful psalm. It's a little bit of a difficult psalm in some ways because I think it's a psalm that can connect with each of us, and it's not always going to connect with us in the area of our lives that we're the most proud of. Sometimes we can relate to this psalm because we have a struggle that we all face. Sometimes that struggle is envy, and sometimes that struggle is jealousy. Sometimes that struggle is an unrealistically negative view of reality. And we have a psalm here written by someone who's battling with all of those things. But then he also seems to overcome those things and praise God at the end of the psalm. And so we're going to look at this psalm and hopefully be able to learn some important and valuable lessons from it. If you look if at Psalm 73, right before verse 1, it'll say, the end of the wicked contrasted with that of the righteous. And so that's really what the struggle is. The psalmist, who is Asaph, by the way, if you look right above verse 1, it says a psalm of Asaph. He seems to be struggling with the idea that if you look at the world, it just doesn't always seem like God is in charge. It's like if I knew that there was a judge who was righteous and just, and he loved me, and he cared about goodness and righteousness, and he could do all things, I would expect that the world would look differently than it does. In fact, there are people who have brought against God the accusation, or brought against Christianity the accusation that there could be no all good, all powerful, and all knowing God. Because if there's evil in the world, and he knows about it, and he doesn't like evil, and he has the power to stop evil, then he should be able to do that. So if there really was a perfect, all-good, all-knowing God, he would know about all evil, he would solve all evil, and he would want there to be no evil. And so a world with a God like that would look very different than our world. At least that's the claim that some people make. And that's the claim that Asaph seems to be struggling with, because he looks at the world and he sees people who have no regard for God on the top, and people who are pure in heart on the bottom. And he sees that wicked people prosper and righteous people suffer. And he says, this doesn't make sense. Is there even any benefit at all to serving God or to keeping my heart pure? I mean, if I do that and I still find myself on the bottom, what's the point of this whole thing? Isn't God good to Israel, or isn't God good to those who are pure in heart? Sometimes it doesn't always feel like it. And that he kind of talks himself into this pit of despair, and he develops this worldview where God is not the judge that we think he should be. And he almost comes to the point of slipping, he says. He almost comes to the point of giving up on God as judge and giving up on the righteousness of God. But he stops himself. Before he reaches that point, he stops himself. And he reminds himself of several very important things that I think we could all be reminded of. And he's able to end the psalm actually by praising God and recalibrating his mind to remember the goodness of God. And I think that's something that we could all use from time to time. Okay, so if you look right above Psalm 73 in your Bible, it might say something like Book 3. This is the first psalm of the third book of the Psalms. So if you remember, the Psalms are actually divided into 5 books, and each of these books has a little bit of a different flavor to it. For example, the third book of the Psalms only has 1 psalm attributed to David, but it has 11 psalms attributed to Asaph. Asaph is the one who writes the first 11 psalms. So it seems like Book 3 might have started as a collection of the Psalms of Asaph, because he has the first 11, and then you see a couple from the sons of Korah, you see one from an Ethan, and then you see 1 psalm of David. And so you kind of go through and the first 11 are Asaph, and then you see a couple there at the end until you get to Book 4, which Book 4 is fascinating how it begins. Do you know who wrote the first psalm of Book 4 of the Psalms? Moses. A lot of people don't usually associate Moses with the Psalms, but Psalm 90 is the first psalm of book 4, and it is a prayer of Moses, the man of God. And so that one's actually attributed to Moses. And so we have so far looked at Psalm 8, which is in book 1, Psalm 42 and 43, which is in book 2. We looked at Psalm 145, which is in book 5, and now we're looking at Psalm 73, which introduces book 3. It introduces these psalms of Asaph. Asaph is an important guy when it comes to the temple and when it comes to Levitical singing and psalms and all of that. In 1 Chronicles 25, we have the account of David appointing Asaph along with someone named Heman and Jeduthun. Heman is also mentioned in book 3 of the Psalms, by the way, but they are stationed to lead in the worship of the temple. And so 1 Chronicles 25 and verse 1, it says, "Moreover, David and the commanders of the army set apart for the service son of the sons of Asaph and Heman and Jeduthun, who were to prophesy, with lyres, harps, and cymbals. And the number of those who performed their service was," and then mentions verse 2, "of the sons of Asaph," and it mentions his sons. And then verse 3, the sons of Jeduthun, and mentions his sons. And then verse 4, of Heman, and mentions his sons. And he says that in verse 6, "All of these were under the direction of their father to sing in the house of the Lord," so to sing in the temple, "with cymbals and harps and lyres for the service of the house of God. Asaph, Jeduthun, and Heman were under the direction of the king." And so Asaph, under the time of King David, is one of those who is first appointed to be a leader in the worship. And it's his sons after him that become leaders in the singing service there at the temple. And so Psalm 73 and those following are attributed to him. They are Psalms of Asaph, who is this leader in temple singing. But even a leader in temple singing can have his dark days. He can have his days of despair. He can have his doubts. And I think that's also an important thing that is helpful for me to remember when we go through this psalm is this is a righteous person who's writing this psalm. This isn't some wicked guy who doesn't love God. He legitimately loves God, but he's confused and he has doubts. And there are times throughout my life that I get confused, and there are times throughout my life that I have doubts. And it's helpful to know that there are actually inspired accounts of people in Scripture who have the same types of doubts that I do, and yet they remain faithful to God. And I think it's a reminder that you're not a bad person for having doubts. You're gonna have doubts. I think every serious thinking Christian that I know has some areas that they struggle with, some doubts that they have. It's really hard not to have doubts. And so this is how an inspired writer and an inspired singer and worshiper in God's temple and in God's house of praise, how he struggles with doubts and how he overcomes them. And so let's begin Psalm 73 and verse 1. He begins by stating the fact. This is the fact that he knows in his heart and in his head, he thinks, but it's also the fact that he's doubting. This is what's causing all the problem, because this is supposed to be true, but it doesn't seem like this is true. It's cognitive dissonance taking place in his mind. There's something that he's been taught his whole life, and he believes this has to be true, and his mind tells him this is true. But then he opens his eyes and he looks at the world around him, and it doesn't always look like it's true. And so verse 1, this is the fact. "Surely God is good to Israel, to those who are pure in heart." All right, surely that's true, right? Certainly God cares about his people, is good to his people, and is good to those who try to keep their hearts pure before him. He's good to those who love him. So surely that's true. But then next time, notice the first word of verse 2. "But as for me, my feet came close to stumbling, and my steps almost slipped." He says, I know the fact that God is good, but I almost slipped. I almost turned away from him. I almost stumbled and fell. Why? Well, that's what he's going to explain in the Psalm. Something was causing him to doubt and possibly even walk away from that fact, walk away from the idea of the goodness of God. One thing I think we should notice as we go through in verse 1, when he says, to those who are pure in heart, the word heart, that word right there, is used 5 times in this psalm. It's like every 6 or 7 verses, you'll see the word pop up again. And it's used more in this psalm than any other psalm. It kind of structures the flow of the psalm because he's looking at his heart, the hearts of others, the heart that God is fully aware of, the heart that God cares about. And so he goes back to this idea of the heart. He mentions in verse 1 the ideal that God is good to those who are pure in heart. But then he looks at the people who are actually blessed. And he talks about these wicked people who have wealth and they have power and prestige and all the food they can want and all the luxury they want. And he says, but their hearts are horrible in verse 7. He says, their eyes bulge with fatness and the imaginations of their heart, which we'll talk about that phrase in a minute. He says, they run riot. It's like the imaginations of their heart are not pure. They're doing whatever they want to do, and yet they have everything that they want. He says in verse 13, when he starts reflecting on his own life, he says, surely in vain I have kept my heart pure and washed my hands in innocence. God's supposed to be good to those who are pure in heart. Well, I've kept my heart pure, and I don't have anything like they do. I have way less than them. And it doesn't seem like my life is all that easy or good. In fact, I struggle. I have despair. I have hardship. It's like, was it pointless to keep my heart pure? Does God not even care? And so he's asking these questions about, does God even see the heart? Does God care about the pure heart? And then you look a little bit further in verse 21. After all of these thoughts, he says, he describes his heart at that stage as embittered. He says, when my heart was embittered, I was pierced within. So his heart was a pure heart, but then he realizes it was actually becoming a bitter heart. It was a heart that was upset or angry with God, a heart that was judging the way God does things. And his heart was not what it ought to be. And then he says in verse 26, my flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. I said, he says it 6 times, I think, or 5 times. I guess he actually says it 6 times. He says it in 5 different verses. But he uses it 2 times there in verse 26. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart. And that's as he's building his conclusion. So he's looking at the fact that his heart isn't always probably what it should be. He thinks he has this pure heart, right? But it's actually kind of a bitter heart. It's a heart that fails. But when God is there with him, God is actually he who supports and strengthens his heart. And so it's kind of an important psalm for looking at the idea of the heart. The heart goes all the way through it. And you can see the rises and the falls of Asaph's heart. And you can see how that compares with the hearts of others. But let's keep looking. Verses 1 and 2. The idea is God is supposed to be good, but he's starting to doubt that fact. Verse 3, he says, for I was envious of the arrogant, and I saw the prosperity of the wicked. And so this is what the problem is. He becomes arrogant, and he becomes envious because he sees the prosperity of the wicked. And that arrogance is a really important idea. Which we'll talk about. But he says, I became envious. He was looking at the world around him, and he was seeing that there were people who had so much more than him, even though they didn't lead in the worship of the house of God like he does. And they didn't spend their lives in service and worship to the king. And they didn't have pure hearts. And they weren't innocent. They were guilty of horrible things. And yet they seemed to prosper, and they seemed to be blessed. And that's not the way you would want a judge to act. You wouldn't want there in the court case, the person who is innocent to be sentenced to the prison and the person who's guilty to be rewarded. You would think that'd be a horrible judge. Well, if God is supposed to be the judge, why is it that when we look at the world, you have wicked people who are elevated and righteous people who are demoted? Like, where's the justice in that? And so he begins to describe these wicked people, these guilty people who are blessed. And he says in verse 4, for there is no pains in their death, and their body is fat. That means they've had plenty to eat their whole lives, and they die in comfort. He says in verse 5, they are not in trouble as other men, nor are they plagued like mankind. Therefore, pride is their necklace, and the garment of violence covers them, and their eyes bulge from fatness, and the imaginations of their heart run wild. They mock, and they wickedly speak of oppression. They speak from on high, and they have set their mouths against the heavens, and their tongue parades through the earth. All right, so that description right there doesn't paint a beautiful picture of these people. They are arrogant, they're prideful, they're violent, they mistreat and oppress, and then they laugh about it with their buddies while they're perched up on high above all of the pains that everyone else goes through. He says, you look at the wicked, and their necks are adorned with pride and arrogance. Their eyes bulge from fatness. He uses very vivid language to describe how they look at the world from their perched seats high above everyone else, in comfort and in luxury and in ease and in excess. They have way more than they'll ever be able to eat, and they just gorge themselves. And he says all of these things about them, and God doesn't punish them. God just lets them get more and more and more and more, and he lets them be wealthier, and he lets them continue in the pride and the arrogance. He lets them continue in the violence. He says in verse 7, it's an interesting phrase, the final phrase there, the imaginations of their heart run riot. That word imaginations right there, if you look that word up, it's used in other places in the Old Testament, and it's actually usually used to describe graven images or pictures or paintings that are painted on walls. There's this passage in Ezekiel chapter 8 where Ezekiel is there as a Babylonian exile, and yet he's taken from his house back to Jerusalem to the temple, and he gets to peek inside the temple, and he sees all the things that are happening at the temple and in the courtyard and all of that stuff. And what he sees is idolatry and wickedness and people turning against God, people worshiping other gods, and all of these bad things are happening. But he gets this view inside the temple, and inside the temple, what he sees are these images to other gods that are painted and carved all in there. The word that's used to describe those images is this word right here. In fact, we are told in the book of Leviticus specifically, don't make this word right here. Don't make these types of images. This word is often used to describe like images that people make and idols and idolatrous engraven images. Well, when it seems to be used of the way people are thinking or the images of the heart, it's kind of like the idea that our hearts and our minds have the ability to paint pictures. We have the ability to create these false realities. And that's what he's saying that they do. It's in the same way that your hand can make an image, your mind can make an image, your heart can make an image. And the image might not correspond to reality at all. Like an idol doesn't correspond to reality. There's only one God. And if you make this image, you're making a false God. What he's saying is these people, they have created these images in their hearts and in their minds. Their imaginations is how it's translated in the New American Standard. And he says, and these are false images, but their heart runs riot after them. And you know what? They don't even get punished for it. And they're actually able to accomplish these false images that they build up in their minds. They mock and they wickedly speak of oppression. You know, if you're not oppressed, you can mock the idea of oppression. You can mock those who actually do suffer. And that's what he says these people are doing. They've set their mouths against the heavens. And so they speak against God. They speak against his people. They do wicked things, and punishment seems to avoid them. It says in verse 10, therefore, his people return to this place, and waters of abundance are drunk by them. They say, how does God know? And is there knowledge with the Most High? Behold, these are the wicked, and they are always at ease, and they always increase in wealth. And so that's his final description of these wicked people. They question, oh, God doesn't even know. God doesn't care what we're doing. Is there even knowledge among the Most High? It's like they're saying they can do all these things, and God hasn't stopped them. So God must not even know what's going on. They didn't doubt necessarily the existence of God. It's just like I don't think Asaph is doubting the existence of God. Asaph seems to be doubting the goodness of God, whereas these wicked people seem to be doubting the knowledge of God. Asaph is thinking, does God actually even care to do good for people who are good? Does God really care about doing good to Israel and to people who are pure in heart? Whereas the wicked people are saying, God must not even know what we're doing here. Is there even knowledge among the Most High? And so they're doubting these different aspects of who God is. They're doubting whether or not he knows about the wickedness in the world, or they're doubting whether or not he can stop or cares to stop the wickedness that's in the world. And so that seems to be the question on everyone's heart as we go through this psalm. One verse I read that is kind of an interesting one is verse 10. What I want to do with verse 10 is I want to read to you the way this verse is translated in other translations, because what you'll find is verse 10 is one of those interesting places in the Bible that no one really knows what to do with. Translators don't really know what to do with it, which is why if you pick up like 5 different Bibles, you'll get 5 wildly different translations of verse 10, of Psalm 73 and verse 10. So I'm going to read it in a couple of different translations and just see how different it sounds in each one. The one I just read it from says this: "Therefore, his people return to this place, and waters of abundance are drunk by them." Notice how it reads in this translation. It says, "Thus the people turn back to them, and they lap up their words." Well, that's quite different, right? "Thus the people turn back to them" is the same as "therefore this people return to this place." Okay, there's some similarities there. But then that final phrase, "and waters of abundance are drunk by them," versus "and they lap up their words." Or consider the way it's translated. This is one of my favorite translations of the Old Testament. It's called the Jewish Study Bible, called the Tanakh. And basically, it is a Bible written by Jews, or translated by Jews. And it's one of my favorite to read the Old Testament in. But notice how they translate this. "So they pound his people again and again until they are drained of their very last tear." So you compare that one, where my verse 10 in the New American Standard says, "Therefore his people return to this place," versus, "and so they pound the people again and again." I guess again and again would be the idea of the return. You know, it happens over and over again. They return over and over again. And then it says, "until they are drained of their very last tear." This says waters of abundance are drunk by them. So you have liquid, tears in water, and the water is either being, drunk all of it up to where it's all gone, or it is being drained of the very last tear. The New Revised Standard says, "Therefore this people turn and praise them." And for that final phrase, instead of saying that they drain their last tear, or waters of abundance are drunk by them, or whatever it says in this one, they lap up their words, this one ends by saying, "and no fault," and find no fault in them. You could go through and you could do this with translation after translation. The New International, "Therefore their people return to them and drink up waters in abundance." But then there's a footnote, and I think the footnote's the important thing. It says, "The meaning of the Hebrew for this verse is uncertain," and I think that's getting pretty clear. The Septuagint, the Greek translation, an English translation of that, says, "Therefore my people will return here, and full days will be found for them." Full days will be found for them. Waters of abundance will be drunk by them. They find no fault in them. They lap up their words. There's all of these different ways of translating that second phrase that all of these Bibles have taken their shot at. Here is basically what I think kind of the idea of the passage is. I think the idea of the passage is you have these wealthy people, and they're almost at like rock star status. Like, people follow after them, even his people, according to, so in the New International, or in the New American Standard, verse 10 says, "Therefore his people," and it's not capitalized, but some translations capitalize the his, as though they think it's talking about God's people. And some will say their people, or something like that. But I think the idea of it is these people who are wicked, who have been described, have become so prominent and so prosperous and so popular. They're kind of like movie stars, or they're kind of like people that everyone looks to and idolizes. And it says even God's people have looked after them. And what those wealthy people have done, they've either drunk the waters of these people in abundance. So basically, they have taken things from them, or they've pounded them so that the people don't even have tears. And yet, the people don't seem to find fault in them, which is how the NRSV translates it. They find no fault in them. It's like there are people who maybe you love their movies, but their personal life is a wreck. And it's like you look at them and you don't even find fault because you like their movies so much. Or there might be politicians who, you like their stance on certain issues, but they're horribly immoral people. And you just kind of overlook all of those things because you like their stance on certain things. He says, basically, there are people who are wicked, and yet people go after them. They follow after them. They return to them time and time again. And even when they're mistreated, or even when they've cried out all of their tears, or even when they've been pounded by them, or all of these different translations, even when bad things happen, they don't find fault in them, and they keep giving them more and more and more praise and adoration. In fact, that's the NRSV says, therefore the people return and praise them. It's like, even when these people are taking advantage of you, and even when these people are wicked, they still get praise for it. And especially that's alarming if these people that are praising them are supposed to be the people of God. And so I think the idea of it is something kind of like that. You have these people who are wicked, yet being praised, even while they are oppressing other people. So Asaph sees all of that. And his conclusion in verse 13 and 14, this is where he gets kind of at the darkest moment of his mind. He says, surely in vain I have kept my heart pure and washed my hands in innocence. He says, looking at all of this, looking at the way the world is and looking at all these people, it must just be in vain, pointless, worthless that I've tried to keep my heart pure. What's the purpose in following God if he's not actually a just judge? What's the purpose in following God if he's not actually going to do what justice would demand that he do? Does he care? Well, apparently not. And that's where he says, I almost stumbled. I almost slipped. I almost fell. I almost left. But he ends up stopping himself before he gets to that point. He says it was vain to keep his heart pure and to wash his hands in innocence. The reason, he says, for I have been stricken all day long and chastened every morning. It's like every day my life is hard. These other people, their lives are easy. They don't love God. Why should I? Why can't I be more like them? Maybe I'd be more blessed if I were like them. If I cheated to get to the top instead of keeping my heart pure. If I oppressed people in order to get more. Maybe that's the way the world calls us to live, and we don't seem to have a judge who stops it. But then he says in verse 15, and verse 15 through 17 is really the transition. This is where he starts rethinking his issue, and he starts coming to some better conclusions. He starts solving this mental fog that he is in. He says in verse 15, if I had said, I will speak thus, behold, would have betrayed a generation of your children. When I pondered to understand this, it was troublesome in my sight, until I came to the sanctuary of God. Then I perceived their end. So he says, so if I had gone around teaching these ideas that I'm having, I would have betrayed the youth of Israel. I would have betrayed a generation of the children of God. I would have perhaps turned people against God if I went around saying all of these things. And so he stopped and he pondered. Okay, what really is the truth here? And it seems that stopping and rationally pondering and thinking through it didn't solve his problem. There are issues, and I think this is an important point. There are issues that you will have. And we live in a society that's very individualistic. We live in a society that highly values reason and rationality and critical thinking, and I think those things are important. But sometimes what you might need even more than that is not to sit in a room by yourself pondering and thinking and reflecting and meditating and philosophizing, but to actually go be with the people of God and actually go spend some time with God. Go worship in the house of the Lord. Go worship with the people of God. And he says it was when he went to the sanctuary of God, that's when he started to perceive. That's when he started to gain a proper perspective. And so notice one of the things that shifts is he no longer seems to be doing this alone, but he is now thinking about the sons or the children of God. So he's thinking about others also. He's thinking in community now. And he's also not just pondering and it troubling him alone, but he's going to be out with people, and he's going to be out at the sanctuary where he can worship God. And I would say if you are having some doubts like he's been having, he's going to give us a couple of ideas. I'm going to mention 4 of them that are really helpful to keep with us as we conclude the psalm. And the first one is don't battle these things alone. Spend more time with God and with his people. One of the most dangerous things a person can do if they're going through doubts about their faith is to stop praying and to stop going to church and to stop gathering together with God's people. It's at that point that you need to do that more than anything else in the world. That's when that is most needed. Even if you have to force yourself, I think that's when it's most needed and most valuable to you is when you do not want to. And what he's saying is he was troubled and he was distressed and he was doubting and he was almost going to turn away from God, but he still went to the sanctuary. He still saw God's people. He still worshiped God. And that's when the proper moment of reflection came. That's when the proper understanding, and that's when the whole change of heart started to swell up within him. And so he says that it was when going to the sanctuary that made this. So point number one, I would say, when it comes to getting yourself out of one of these periods of doubt in one of these dark moments, is spend more time with God and with his people. Secondly, he says, about these wicked, in verse 18, surely you set them in slippery places. You cast them down to destruction. How they are destroyed in a moment. They are utterly swept away by sudden terror, like a dream when one awakes. O Lord, when aroused, you will despise their form. Another thing that he does is he kind of awakens to reality a little bit more. I don't think everything he said in the first part of the psalm is completely true. What I mean is, if you look at the world, yes, you see wicked people prosper, but you don't only see wicked people prosper. And if you look at the world, you see wicked people prosper, but you don't see all wicked people prosper. It's like if you get tunnel vision and you focus just on a small number of wicked people who are doing well, that could shape your whole view of reality. And what he seems to do is he's looking only at the hardships of good people and only at the ease of the wicked, and he's ignoring like almost everything else. And sometimes we can get so unrealistically pessimistic that we don't have an accurate view of reality anymore. And we could say, oh man, only bad people get good things. Well, that's not actually true. There are a lot of people who, because of sin and because of wickedness, have destroyed their lives. Like, that's a common thing that happens in the life of people. People often find themselves in places they never wanted to be because of bad decisions that they've made. Certainly, there are consequences to actions. It's not very realistic to look at the world and to pretend as though everything is hard on me because I'm so good and everything is good for them because they're so wicked. First of all, we might not be as good as we tend to think that we are. Second of all, these people who are wicked, who are prospering, they probably have more problems in your life than you're giving them credit for. And so I think awakening to reality is a really important it's a really important moment. And it seems that he has it. And he starts recognizing, okay, even those people who do seem to be on the mountaintop, it can be slippery up there. You know, there's a passage in the New Testament that says not to put your hope in the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy in 1 Timothy 6. And I think the idea of the uncertainty of riches, he forgot about. He seems to think, oh man, everything's always going to be good for them. But he doesn't recognize people rise and people fall. People who do good end up doing well. People who do wicked end up doing well. But sometimes those wicked people fall. And in the final moments, or in the final judgment, in the final outlook, your life is not going to be better. When you finally stand before God, your life is not better by having rejected him. As a matter of fact, your life is infinitely better by being close to God. And so that's the reality that he's bringing himself towards. He has to kind of awaken up to that and realize that he has clouded his judgment a little bit. But I do think he's starting to awaken up to it. He says in verse 21, when my heart was embittered, I was pierced within. So like those moments when he was really doubting God, or when he was angry with God, when he was bitter towards God, he says he was pierced within. Then I was senseless and ignorant, and I was like a beast before you. He says, when I turned against God, it was like, that's when I stopped being rational. That's when I started acting more like a beast. If you remember all the way back in verse 3, he says, for I was envious of the arrogant. There are people who are arrogant, and there are people who seem to immediately think that they are better than everyone else. And an idea that I think comes through in this psalm is that Asaph himself became envious of the arrogant, and in that same time, he himself became arrogant. He adopted their arrogance in himself, and their hearts. He adopted a heart of bitterness. And it was like the people who he most despised, he started becoming like them because he was turning against God like them. But I think the idea of arrogance is a really important one, especially when it comes to our dissatisfaction with God. One of my favorite poems is written by Alexander Pope. It's an essay on man, and there's this section of it where he describes what it really means for human beings to judge God. Because we often find ourselves doing that, if we don't like the way the world is going. Or Asaph, he sits here, he looks at the world, he thinks, this isn't the way that it should be. And he puts himself in the seat of judging the way things ought to be. And then he finds God guilty because God's the one who's not doing things the way he ought to do them. And if you think about what that means, it means you've put yourself as God's judge. Or in essence, you put yourself as God's God. I want to read this poem just kind of as we start drawing this to a close. But I think it's an important reminder that we're not actually qualified to be God's judge. We're not actually qualified. We don't have the information that God has. We have no idea when something negative in our life might end up producing something positive. Just a quick illustration, but a lot of people are getting vaccines right now for COVID. If you give children, when they get vaccines, when you give a vaccine to a child, they don't fully understand that what's happening is actually done for the sake of protecting them, for making them healthier, to making their bodies stronger so that they can fight off diseases or things like that. Like, they don't understand that. What they understand is, ow, there's a needle, don't do this. That's bad, don't do this. And I think sometimes we can have the tendency in our lives to see a needle and think, ow, don't do this, this is bad, and not understand that there might actually be some benefit on the other side of this thing. And I'm not trying to get into a vaccination debate. I'm just using an illustration. But the idea, I think, is that we don't have the knowledge that God has. And God might see things in our lives that are negative for us in the moment, but could ultimately be good for us down the road. And we don't have the ability to do that. So we should never put ourselves as the people who judge God. The poem says this: Go wiser thou, and in thy scale of sense, weigh thy opinion against providence. Call imperfection what thou fanciest such. Say, here he gives too little, and there too much. Destroy all creatures for thy sport or gust, yet cry, if man's unhappy, God's unjust. If man alone gross not heaven's high care, alone made perfect here, immortal there. Snatch from his hand the balance and the rod, rejudge his justice, be the God of God. The idea is, when we do that, we end up snatching the rod of justice from God's hand and claiming it for ourselves. We end up rejudging his justice as though we're the ones who are actually in charge. We end up being the God of God. We look at the world and we say, oh, there he gives too little, there too much. All of a sudden we act like we know more than he does. And I think that's one of the problems that Asaph is struggling through. And he says, he in this moment of realization goes from being what he considers the proper one who understands and the one who says that God is being unjust, he's being God's God, to the end of verse 22, he recognizes, I was senseless and ignorant, and I was like a beast before you. He finally realizes we're all ignorant when it comes to the mind of God. We're all ignorant as to the purposes of God and why God would do things and why God would allow things. And to act like we're not is an unrealistic view of reality. So he concludes the psalm with our fourth admonition. Basically, the first one is spend more time with the people of God and with God. The second one is to awaken to reality. Don't become so unrealistically pessimistic that our view of reality is no longer adequate. The third one is humble ourselves, Don't try to be God's God. Recognize there are things we don't know. There might be purposes that we are unaware of that God has, and live as though that's on the table and that we can trust God even if we don't understand. We're not told to understand, to know, or to approve of everything God does. We're told to trust God and to follow. And I think that that's a helpful reminder. But then the final admonition is to recalibrate our idea of what good actually is. In verse 23 through 28, I think that's what he's going to do. Because at first he had been thinking, well, the wealth and the fatness and the splendor and the excess, that's what the good is. And that's what these people have. And that's what I want. But then he realizes, you know what? Maybe I've had the good this whole time. Maybe the real good in this life isn't fatness and splendor and wealth and luxury and power and prominence. Maybe the good is actually something else. Maybe God himself is the good that we seek to attain. So verse 23 through 28 says, "Nevertheless, I am continually with you. You have taken hold of my right hand. Your counsel will guide me, and afterwards receive me to glory. Whom have I in heaven but you? And besides you, I desire nothing on earth." Compare that with the way he was talking earlier about how he wants everything that the rich people have, or he wants everything that the wicked people have. What he ends up saying is, you know what? Everything on in heaven and on earth that I could ever possibly want is you, God. So he starts recalibrating his idea of what good actually is. And being the one who is near God, the one who, verse 23, is continually with God, who is being led by his right hand by God, that's actually what the good is all about. He says in verse 26, "My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." I shouldn't put my trust in myself and in my heart and in my mind and in my ability to reason and my ability to figure things out. Just put my trust in God. He's the one who will be my strength henceforth and forevermore. Verses 27 through 28. "Therefore, behold, those who are far from you will perish. You have destroyed all who are unfaithful to you. Those wicked, they don't remain the most blessed ones forever. But," verse 28, "as for me, the nearness of God is my good." That's what good is for me. More important than all the other things you can mention in this world, if I'm near God, that's the goodness that I'm after. Those who are far from God, they don't last. The nearness of God is an eternal good. And he says, "I have made the Lord God my refuge, and I will tell of all your works." He will speak of the goodness of God now. He almost spoke, if you remember in verse 15, if I had said, "I will speak thus," all those bad things, if I will speak all these wicked things about God, behold, I would have betrayed the generation of your children. He concludes by saying, instead of doing that, I'm going to tell people about the goodness of God. I'm going to help other people try to have the same realization. And then he writes it down so that we can. We can be reminded of the goodness of God. We can be reminded of the treasure that we have in the closeness and in the nearness of God. There will be times of doubt in your life. There surely will. There are in my life. I think every Christian struggles through that sometimes. But spend time with God and his people. Spend time at church. Go worship in community with people. I think it'll help you. More so than trying to figure everything out on your own, spending time with the people of God will be a tremendous and rich blessing. Try to awaken to reality and don't get so clouded in your judgment that we can only see bad around us. There's more good than we sometimes realize. Try to be humble as we approach God. Don't be the God of God. Don't judge God. Don't act like we know the way God ought to do things, and we know the way God ought to answer our prayers, and we know the way God ought to fix all of these problems. Let's just see what God does and trust him in the process. And finally, recalibrate the idea of what good actually is. The goodness is not always having the most money or being the most popular or having the most power or getting the best job or having the most prestige. The person who has a close relationship with God, who has strength day in and day out, who has peace that passes understanding so that you can sing praises to God even while in prison. That person, I believe, has a greater good than anyone else on this earth could ever have. That's the good for which we all should attain. I love you, and may the love of God be with you.